I spent enough time on the trail to know that getting lost doesn't usually happen all at once. Most of the time, it happens one step at a time. You miss a trail marker, you take a turn that seems right, you keep walking because you're making good time. The trail is easy, the weather is good, everything feels fine. Until eventually you look around and realize you are no longer where you thought you were. The strange thing is that effort isn't the issue. You may have been walking hard all day. You may have covered miles. You may have been moving with purpose. But if you're on the wrong trail, all that effort simply takes you further from where you need to be. Welcome back to Eremos. Over the last few episodes, we've been walking through a series of questions. The wilderness revealed anger I didn't know I was carrying. It revealed desires I didn't fully understand. It revealed pursuits that had been shaping the direction of my life for years. At first, I thought that was the point, that God brought me into the wilderness to show me what was wrong. And in some ways, He did. But looking back, I realized God wasn't just revealing something, He was preparing something. Most of us don't struggle because we lack desire. We struggle because we don't always know where our desires are leading us. The things we chase shape the direction of our lives. What we pursue reveals what we trust. What we trust eventually determines where we end up. But after that first wilderness trip, another question began to surface. If God had revealed what I desired, if He had revealed what I was chasing, what was He going to do with that information? Was the goal simply awareness? Was it confession? Or was He leading me somewhere I couldn't see yet? I didn't know it then, but God was about to answer that question. Not with a sermon, not with a Bible study, not even with another revelation about what was wrong. He was about to begin showing me where He was leading, and it started with another hike. The first hike had changed something. I came home lighter than I had left. God had revealed anger I didn't know I was carrying, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. But if I'm honest, it still felt like something was missing. I couldn't have told you what it was. I just knew God wasn't finished. My wife and I had already decided hiking needed to become a regular part of my life. We hoped I could get out on the trail every week, even if it was only for a few hours. Overnight trips weren't realistic very often, but day hikes were. So that's where I started. The next week after the first hike, I was sitting in church listening to a sermon. And to be honest, I don't remember much about what the pastor was talking about. What I do remember is the conversation God was having with me. For several days, my Bible reading had been centered around wilderness stories, especially Jesus' temptation in Matthew 4. So when the wilderness came up in the sermon, even briefly, it immediately caught my attention. Wilderness. God. I can do that. Then another thought. I need a name. Eremos. The Greek word for wilderness. I liked the sound of it. The pastor continued preaching, but by then my mind was racing. As he talked about Jesus in the wilderness, he mentioned 3 temptations: desire, pride, and power. Those 3 words settled into my mind and refused to leave. For the next week, I kept turning them over. Desire, pride, power. What did they mean? Why wouldn't they leave me alone? And what, if anything, was God trying to show me through them? A week later, I decided to take another hike. Nothing ambitious, just a few hours on a local trail while the kids were at school. Those 3 words had been turning over in my mind all week. I didn't know exactly what they meant, but I couldn't stop thinking about them. So I grabbed my backpack and headed for the trail. This time, I brought a journal. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a few notes, maybe a couple of thoughts. I figured if God showed me something, I'd write it down. I tucked the journal into an outside pocket where I could get to it if I needed it. I assumed that would happen not very often. I was wrong. About 2 minutes into the hike, I stopped. I could still see the parking lot. My wife hadn't even driven away yet, and I was already pulling my pack off to get my journal. A thought had come so clearly that I didn't want to lose it, so I wrote it down. A short sentence, nothing fancy, just enough to capture it. Then I put the journal away, shouldered my pack, and started walking again. A few minutes later, I stopped, backpack off, journal out, another thought, another sentence, another note. At some point, I realized this wasn't going to be an occasional thing. So I moved the journal from my backpack to my shoulder strap where I could grab it quickly. And for the next hour or so, that's how the hike went. Walk, stop, write, walk, stop, write. Over and over again. Thought after thought, sentence after sentence. It felt like God was opening a door faster than I could walk through it. I remember one particular moment when a thought came to my mind and I decided I'd write it down later. I was already working through another idea and didn't want to lose my train of thought. But the sentence wouldn't leave. It just kept sitting there, waiting. I tried to move on. The thought stayed. I tried to think about something else. The thought stayed. Finally, I stopped walking and laughed. Okay, Lord. I pulled out the journal and wrote it down, and almost immediately the thought was gone. Not forgotten, just released. Like I had finally done what I was supposed to do with it. By then, I knew something unusual was happening. I had gone into the wilderness hoping for a little more information. Instead, it felt like God was giving me something I couldn't fully understand yet. As I kept walking and writing, another thought came to mind. Not about desire, not about pride, not about power. My mom. For as long as I can remember, she used to tell me I was going to be a preacher someday. And every time she said it, I would laugh. Nope. Not interested. Not happening. I had absolutely no desire to stand behind a pulpit. I couldn't imagine myself doing that. So whenever she brought it up, I'd tell her the same thing. I'll never be a preacher. And I still stand behind that statement. As I stood there on the trail, journal in hand, a strange realization hit me. I was writing what looked an awful lot like a sermon. Not a hiking plan, not trail notes, not a ministry strategy. Page after page of thoughts about God, the wilderness, and desire. And suddenly, I could hear my mother's voice in my head. The same voice I'd heard for years. You're going to be a preacher someday. I remember stopping on the trail and just standing there. And the tears came. Not the quiet kind, the kind that show up without permission, the kind that make it difficult to see where you're walking. I don't know exactly how to explain it. I don't know if people in heaven can see what's happening on earth. Scripture doesn't give us many details about that. But standing there on the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that my mom could see that moment, and she was smiling. Proud, happy, and probably saying exactly what she had been saying to me my entire life. Told you so. For a few minutes, all I could do was stand there and cry. The wilderness had already revealed anger that I didn't know I was carrying. Now it was uncovering something else, something I hadn't expected. Purpose. Not a fully formed ministry, not a clear roadmap, just a seed. A small glimpse that God might be doing something bigger than I understand. The more I sat with those journal pages, the more I realized something. At the time, I thought God was answering my questions. I thought He was helping me understand those 3 words: desire, pride, power. I thought I was gathering information, but God wasn't giving me information. He was giving me direction. I went into the wilderness hoping for a little more clarity, maybe a few answers, maybe a few notes in a journal. Instead, I walked away with the entire desire section of what would eventually become the Eremos Wilderness Workbook. Even then, I wasn't thinking about a workbook. I wasn't thinking about a podcast. Wasn't thinking about a ministry. I just knew God had given me something that felt important, something that felt alive, something I couldn't quite explain. The more I sat with those pages, the more I realized God wasn't removing my desires. He was redirecting them. For months, I had been focused on peace. I wanted life to settle down. I wanted stability. I wanted relief from everything that had happened. But on that trail, God began showing me that He had a much bigger picture in mind. I thought I needed my circumstances to change, but God was changing me. I thought I needed answers. God was giving me purpose. I thought I was looking for a way back to the life I had before. God was leading me towards something new. And the more I think about it, the more it reminds me of Moses, because Moses had desires too. And his story teaches us something important about what God often does with our desires. When we first meet Moses in Exodus, he sees his suffering people. He sees injustice, he sees oppression, and something inside him he can't ignore. Moses wants to help. That's important. His desire wasn't wrong. In fact, it seems like God would eventually use that very desire to deliver Israel. But Moses had a problem. He wanted to accomplish God's purpose his own way. One day he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Moses steps in. He kills the Egyptian and hides the body. The next day people are talking about it. Pharaoh hears about it, and Moses runs. Just like that, the man who wanted to rescue God's people finds himself alone in the wilderness. For 40 years, I've often wondered what those 40 years felt like. Did Moses think he had failed? Did he wonder if God could still use him? Did he believe the opportunity had passed him by? Scripture doesn't tell us much about those years, but eventually God appears in a burning bush and calls Moses back. And that's what strikes me, is that God doesn't remove Moses' desire, he redirects it. Moses still wants to see God's people set free. That hasn't changed. What changes is the path. The younger Moses believed he had to force the outcome. The older Moses learns to follow God. Different path, same desire. And maybe that's one of the things the wilderness does. Sometimes the wilderness reveals what is already there, but sometimes the wilderness reshapes what is there. The wilderness didn't remove Moses' desire. It transformed the man carrying it. As I reflected on that second hike, I couldn't help but see a little bit of myself in that story. Not because my story is anything like Moses's, but because I had spent months focused on what I thought I needed: peace, stability, relief. And God wasn't condemning those desires. He was redirecting them, just as he did with Moses. Different path, same desire. We see the same pattern in Paul. Before his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, Paul was passionate, committed, zealous. He genuinely believed he was serving God. That's what makes his story so interesting. Paul wasn't lacking desire. He had plenty of desire. He wasn't lacking conviction or discipline or commitment. If anything, he had all of those in abundance. The problem wasn't his desire. It was his direction. Paul believed persecuting Christians was an act of faithfulness. Then he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and that changed everything. And just like Moses, Jesus didn't remove Paul's desire, he redirected it. Paul's passion remained, his zeal remained, his commitment remained. But now all of those things were surrendered to God's purpose instead of Paul's understanding. Different path, same desire. And that's what's encouraging to me, because sometimes we assume that if God is correcting us, he must be disappointed. We assume that if God redirects us, it means we've gotten everything wrong. But Moses wasn't rejected, he was redirected. Paul wasn't discarded, he was redirected. And maybe that's true for us as well. Maybe God isn't trying to destroy everything we desire. Maybe he's teaching us where those desires belong. Maybe he's showing us the path they were meant to follow all along. As I think about my own story and the stories of Moses and Paul, one truth keeps rising to the surface. God often doesn't just redirect our desires, he redeems them. For a long time, I thought spiritual growth meant learning to not want things. Not wanting peace, not wanting stability, not wanting purpose, just wanting God. But that's not what I see in Scripture. Moses still wanted to see God's people free. Paul still wanted to serve God. Their desires weren't removed, they were redirected. The same thing was happening in my life. I wanted peace. God wasn't condemning that desire. He was teaching me where peace is found. I wanted stability. God wasn't condemning that desire either. He was teaching me what is truly stable. I wanted purpose. What I didn't realize was that God was already planting it. That's what holy desire is. It's not the absence of desire, it's desire surrendered to God. It's allowing God to shape not only what we want, but how we pursue it. It's trusting that his path is better than the one we would choose for ourselves. And that's not always easy, because sometimes where God is leading is not where our desires are leading. Sometimes he takes us in a direction we never would have chosen. Sometimes he asks us to release our timeline, our plans, shortcuts, our assumptions. But what I've discovered is that God's redirection is not rejection. When God redirects a desire, he's not destroying it, he's redeeming it. He's teaching us to desire the right things in the right way. And maybe that's what's happening on the trail. I thought God was giving me information about desire. What he was actually doing was teaching me to trust him with mine. The goal isn't becoming someone who desires less. The goal is learning to desire what God desires and learning to trust him enough to follow wherever those desires lead. So let me leave you with a few questions. Not questions for you to answer right now, just questions for you to carry, questions to sit with, to take into your own wilderness. What desire might God be redirecting? Is there something you've been asking God for that hasn't happened yet? Something you've been pursuing? Or something you've been holding on to? Something you've convinced yourself that will finally make everything okay? Have you already decided how God must fulfill them? Have you already mapped out the route? Have you already chosen the destination? Have you already determined what obedience should look like? Because sometimes God says yes to the desire and no to the path. Sometimes he says different path, same desire. And if that's where you find yourself today, maybe the invitation isn't to stop desiring. Maybe the invitation is to surrender the desire to God. Trust that he sees something you can't, that his timing is better than yours, that his path ultimately leads somewhere good, even if that's the wilderness. The truth is, I never would have chosen the path that led me to the second hike. I never would have chosen the losses that came before it. I never would have chosen the wilderness. But standing where I am today, I can see that God was doing more than revealing what was in my heart. He was teaching me to trust Him with it. So this week, spend a few minutes alone with God. Turn off the noise, put away the distractions, and ask Him a simple question. Lord, what desire are you teaching me to surrender? And what desire are you teaching me to embrace? Maybe you find yourself today standing at the trailhead, facing a decision, waiting on an answer, trying to understand what God is doing. If so, remember this: God's redirection is not rejection. Sometimes the path He chooses will look different than the one you planned. Sometimes it will be harder, sometimes it will be longer, but His path always leads exactly where He intends. The wilderness reveals what is already there, but it doesn't stop there. Sometimes the wilderness becomes the place where God reshapes our desire. Different wilderness, same question. What does God want you to desire? Thank you for walking with me. Until next time, grace and peace.